Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure for me, on behalf of the International Association of Youth and Family Judges and Magistrates, to welcome you to this webinar, the sixth webinar of a series addressing contemporary issues on justice and children's rights. My name is Marta Pascual. I'm a judge, I'm a juvenile judge in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the president of the association, and I will be coordinating this webinar. Since our foundation in 1928, this association took part in many important moments of children's rights history at an international level, and today, with members for more than 60 countries, organizes congresses every 4 years. The last one was in Paris at the UNESCO House in 2018, and the next one will be held in Mexico in 2022, depending on the pandemic. We are proud to offer to our members and the larger international community in the world many initiatives aiming to improve a better justice for children. And we have some activities such as a comparative study in jurisprudence with many members. We organize study tours every semester in one country. We had organized one in England, but we have to postpone it because of the pandemic also. And we have our monthly newsletter and the chronicle with theoretical and practical analysis of the most important subjects regards children's rights. We believe that and of course our chronicle, our historical chronicle with theoretical and practical analysis of the most important subjects for judges, magistrates, and legal profession that have to deal with it in their work. We believe that the international dialogue has always played a major role in the improvement of legal systems regarding children's rights. We're very pleased to have as a member, inviting you to join our association, and please visit our new website. Today, we'll continue with the webinars program. We have 3 experts on restorative justice. That is a new way of justice for juvenile, and also to give citizens the right to access to justice in a flexible model, adapting each country so its own restorative model. Therefore, I'm very pleased to introduce you to the speakers in the webinars. They will have 50 minutes presentation and a closing round of 3 minutes, ending with the answer. So the first one will be Renate Winter, but he will use the whole time as she has another appointment in her country. So I'll give the floor to Renate. She's the Vice President of the United Nations Committee on the Children's Rights, and member and past president of the Residual Special Court of Sierra Leone. Now she's the team leader of the European project in Georgia, Europe. Renate, your time, and thank you for being with us. Your microphone.
Thank you very much, dear Marta. You forgot to mention something I'm very proud of, namely that I have been president of our association also once before your time. Thank you. And at that time already we have been working together. So thank you very much for inviting me. I try to speak about things that my colleagues Mara and Ivo are not going to take over, but they will maybe go into more details than later on as need might be. We all know already about restorative justice, I think. What we might not know is that it is the oldest system of doing justice in the world. It's the oldest one, the first one. And we find remnants in the tradition of almost all parts in the world, remnants of this old system that we have now renovating once again and not reinventing, because the system still is the same. It is the system of the triangle. The one side, you have the one party, most of the time in penal justice, the offender and his family and surroundings, depending on the system. And then the other side, you have the victim, equally important in the system, the victim and the family of the victim and the surroundings of the victim. And finally, to finalize the triangle, you have the community. All of them have to live together as they have lived before the event. They have to live after the event as well together. And this is the reason why restorative justice is so important, to make peace once again. Because if you do not solve a conflict, the conflict comes back and back and back. And all of us who are judges, Marta, you yourself and me, we know that if we have not solved the conflict, and sometimes the justice, the ordinary justice system cannot solve the conflict will come back. And the parties will come back once again. And this is not so in the penal justice only. It's the same situation in the civil justice. We will not speak about family matters today, but in family matters as well, we have this problem. If we do not solve something, it comes back. I have had the pleasure to find the very first image, picture of restorative justice during a visit in the Louvre. I found a medieval picture of King Louis le Saint, Louis X, Louis the Holy, where he is sitting on a chair looking to both parties and obviously listening to both of them to find a solution. I was not expecting to have such a picture so early in the Middle Ages, but there it was. And I found the same once again, very far away in South Sudan, when I had to work with a judge who went under a big tree in the open and having the parties and the animals and the surroundings and the families and everything coming together under this tree to do justice. It was so impressive, you cannot imagine. I learned a lot of being a really good judge, understanding something about restorative justice. I furthermore found it with the Tuaregs in Africa when I was traveling with them, and when I saw how the Sheikh and his wife were dealing as mediators in family and penal conflicts. No judge around, only them dealing with the issue. I found it together with Ivo in Bhutan, once again. Maybe Ivo will speak about that and I will not in this regard. I found it in the middle of the Titicaca Lake in an island where there is a small population. They had no justice system, they had no justice, but they had restorative justice. So this is, and finally with a colleague from Canada, we found restorative justice with the First Nation in the northern part of Canada. So I hope I could prove that this is really an issue that is not far from the understanding of people. What are now especially the positive impacts concerning children? Because restorative justice, and once again I count on Ivo to speak about this difference of restorative justice between the difference between children and the impact of children and the impact of adults. Children are very open for restorative justice because the pedagogical impact on them is huge. Most often, for the very first time in their life, they are taken seriously and they are given responsibility. Mostly they are dealt with as objects of justice, especially by the justice system. even if the justice system already understands that children are not objects but subjects of law. The dealing very often still is like with an object. You have done this, this is the result, therefore you get this punishment. No? This is not the case in restorative justice, because the very first question of a judge in restorative justice is, do you take responsibility for what you have done? And then only you hand over to the specialists to deal with the children, with the victims and the offender. Because this is not an object for the judges to do. For these mediation issues, for this trying of finding solution, you do not need a judge, you do need a specialist, and this specialist most of the time is a mediator, and the judge should not meddle into it. Of course, a judge can be a mediator, but only after he has been judged in maybe his time after having stopped to become a judge. Once again, it is important, especially for the children, for the pedagogical impact, because a child in the restorative justice system learns to understand what he or she has really done, what he or she has caused as offense, as of harm, concerning harm to a victim, and what the victim really has experienced. In the normal justice system, you do not find that. In the normal justice system, as a judge, I'm asking the meeting, what is your testimony? But I do not ask, what has the harm been for you? This is an issue for restorative justice, and this is especially important for children, because when they understand what harm they have caused, very often, very, very often, they are ready and very quickly ready to do whatever they can to repair the harm. This is not always so with the adults, but once again, this I leave over to Ivo, because there is another rationale behind. When I speak about the work of judges, as I said, judges should not should not deal directly in restorative methods, but they have to understand them. They have to understand what a restorative justice is about. They have to know that it is important for the children, especially the children, to have the possibility to go for restorative justice. They have to hand over, to transfer to the experts the issue. They have to keep the legal safeguards in place if ever there are problems, like for instance, if mediation has taken place, if mediation maybe is not successful, everything that has been dealt with in mediation, every information that has been given stays with the mediation, cannot go to court. The confidentiality of the mediation process is absolutely to be upheld by any judge. No judge has the right to go to the mediator and say, and you tell me now as a witness what has happened. That is out of question. There is something else that should be accepted by judges and prosecutors alike. It is not necessary to say, okay, mediation, restorative justice, and so on, this is only for petty crimes and not for the real issue. First of all, it is for the real issue. And second, if I have a petty crime, then I do not have to criminalize this at all. I do not even need restorative justice for that. I do need to hand it over out of the system, first of all, because to criminalize petty things, a child has stolen 1 liter of milk. I do not need the justice system at all, restorative or not. So this danger to use restorative justice to criminalize the petty things is a danger that we have to deal with. Granting, I have 3 more minutes according to my.
It's okay. It's
yeah. Okay. I would like to speak a little bit about what we really have to grant for, we, especially we the judges and we in the justice system. We have to grant access to restorative justice for everyone, especially for the victims, because victims very often do not know, and very often judges do not say at the end of a criminal procedure, you have still the possibility to find remedies and to find recompensation in a restorative way. And not only you have to run immediately to the civil courts to get something, to get reimbursement. So that is one of the things that we have to deal with. But we have a huge group of vulnerable children, and I will just only mention them in the 2 minutes that I have left, because we always forget about them, always. What about the children of minorities? Do they have access to restorative justice, be it a defendant, be it a victim? What about Roma children in our courts? What about the children in prison? When there are fights between children in prison, do they have a possibility for restorative methodology to deal with those offenses from one to another? Or do we have to go on immediately with punishment, extra punishment for them? What about the children in street situations? How do they get their right to restorative methodology? And how do we deal with disabled children as victims and as offenders? How do we get them into the restorative justice system? That would be my part and my wishes to get an expansion of restorative justice for those children as well. I cannot participate in the final round, so let me just give the key words from my side for my final round. Can we not improve the application via information, via leaflets at courts, via trainings for prosecutors, for defense lawyers, and via positive media coverage? That would be my main points for the last 3 minutes, if somebody could take them on. Thank you very much for giving me the time and the possibility to speak about it. I have still 5 minutes left to listen to the next speaker, and then unfortunately I have to leave. I am really, really sorry, but I have no possibilities. Thank you very much. And please, Ivo, please, Mara, go into it if whatever I have forgotten, not been able to cover in my time. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Renate, for your deep way to teach or to send out messages or the way to learn based on your experience and your knowledge about the way to deal with children. Is really important, the role of the judges, because many of us don't apply to this, or what the convention and other international instruments tell us to do. So thank you very much. And we all, judges and magistrates, wish to have you present here in South America, that we are having a very bad time. Now is the time for Marta. Thank you very much, Marta, for being with the association. Dr. Marta Schiff is currently an associate professor of criminology and criminal justice at Florida Atlantic University. And she serves as vice president of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. Now, Marta, the floor is yours.
I'm so struck. I did not know what Renate was going to say before I just heard it right now. And the parallels to what I've prepared for this are perfect. So I'm delighted on so many of the things you've mentioned. I'm going to share my screen here. This may take a second and hope that it works well and quickly. Did that work? It did work.
Yes,
good.
Perfect.
Because a lot of what was just talked about, the issues of youth and where they are attended to in the system, what types of offenses, how that starts. And particularly, I appreciate your comments about race. because I have come to learn over the years that I personally, this is my belief after 30 years in this field, I don't think I can talk about justice or restorative justice or any form of justice without acknowledging the impact of how what in the US we might refer to as youth of color, or specifically African American and Black youth in the US. And while that's in the US, the population, Renate mentioned the Roma children. In other areas, it's indigenous children. There are many ways that we refer to it, but the process and the practice and the implications and the marginalization is the same. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to speak relatively quickly. I thank you all that this is in English. I could not possibly do this as well as you can in a language that is not my own. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm going to go ahead and speak just a little bit about what I want to cover in this presentation, which is to understand a little bit about juvenile justice in the US, and specifically talk about what we call the school to prison pipeline as a gateway for youth entering the justice system, and how restorative justice practices in schools may help to address that, but look at some of the planning and implementation about how we address that. And this will segue surprisingly well with Renate's comments. And so to follow up on her closing comments about race, what we in the US refer to as disproportionate minority contact, which means the overrepresentation of persons of color at all stages in the justice system relative to their representation in the population. And what we find is that this increases, the disproportionality increases at successive stages in the justice process. And if you look here in this, what we see is that in every case where juvenile arrests in the population are higher for Black children, the cases referred to the justice system are higher for Black juveniles, but the cases diverted are higher for white children. That what we see is cases detained are higher for Black children. What we see is that cases that are petitioned to the court are higher for Black children, and so on. This pattern goes where white children are systematically treated better in the courts, and we'll get to in the school system, than Black children, and where more than 60% of the people in prison are racial and ethnic minorities. For Black males in their 30s, 1 in every 10 may be in jail on any given day. So what I want to talk about really is how this starts in school, because if we talk about places where kids are acculturated into pro-social behavior in their communities, in their societies, the first place that they come into contact with a government institution will be in school. And what we call the school to prison pipeline, and I don't know how that's referred in other countries, is educational policies that increasingly criminalize minor infractions of school rules and expand surveillance. So students are disciplined and suspended for behavior that could be handled inside the school. As a result, these youth wind up out of school, at home or on the street, and vulnerable to police interaction. Students of color are especially vulnerable to this discriminatory application of school discipline. Black children are more likely to be suspended and expelled for minor infractions, and while representing only 17% of school enrollment, are 34% of suspensions. I'll tell you that in every school district I have looked at, Black and minority children are suspended, disciplinarily referred, and sent out of school at anywhere between 2 and 4 times the rate of white children. They are 4 times more likely to end up in correctional facilities if they also have learning disabilities. So what happens is that youth of color are more likely to get suspended for offenses like willful defiance, disobedience, insubordination, teacher disrespect. And so what do you notice about these categories? And it's exactly what Renate was just referring to, about offenses that should not be in the justice system at all, should not be often disciplinarily referred, even in schools, wind up affecting minority children, particularly Black children in our schools at disproportionate rates as white children, whereas white children are not held accountable for what might be considered some of these offenses. Kids of color often are. So why does it matter? Because what we find is that mass incarceration, I'm sorry, I can't see some of my slides because where it is in the way, but I know you can see these. But the inequality leads to increased crime. The perceptions of increased crime leads to harsher and longer incarcerative sentences. And it's ultimately far more costly when we use justice approaches rather than what we'll argue here, restorative approaches to keep kids out of the justice system, in schools, off the streets, in ways that are far more attentive to, again, as Renate noted, including and elevating the voice of the kids, the youth who are most affected. So can restorative justice help? We talk in the US about a whole school approach or a incident-driven approach. And Marta, if you would please help me keep track of time because I'm not timing myself. A whole school approach looks at how to use restorative justice, restorative values throughout the school, building culture and climate. What we find is that building a restorative culture results in fewer incidents of harm overall. What that in turn means is fewer suspensions, fewer kids on the streets and winding up in the justice system. An incident-driven approach uses a restorative justice practice to respond to specific incidences of harm on a school campus, such as fighting, theft, or bullying, or disrespect. And so just to be clear, when we say a restorative response to conflict, and most people on this webinar may already know this, but let's be clear, we're using the same language. A non-adversarial, dialogue-based decision-making process where affected parties discuss the harm done and then create an agreement going forward based on the input of all stakeholders about what's necessary to repair that harm. We often find that when we use the word restorative, we are referring to a variety of things that don't always mean the same practices, processes, values, or principles. So I want to be clear what I'm talking about here. And I'm talking about the difference in a traditional system that focuses on breaking of rules and laying blame and fault and who's deserving of what, to a restorative system where we're focusing on harm and the harm that's been done, what are the needs and whose obligation those are. This comes from Howard Zehr, who most of us know, who literally wrote the book on this, and we all know his work for years. And we're focusing on a particular set of questions. When we apply restorative practices, what happened, what harm was done, who's responsible, what needs to happen to make it right, and how do we prevent this from happening in the future? Again, Renate mentioned, and I'm sure Ivo will also go into, what we don't address often in justice processes is what's next, is how do we prevent this from happening in the future, which is a key element of restorative approaches that isn't always present in our retributive, punitive, justice-oriented approaches. So what does the research say? I'm not going to go through all of this. For those of you who are interested, you can watch the recording of the that will be on YouTube and that will be posted elsewhere, and you can stop this slide, but suffice it to say that research suggests that restorative justice is an evidence-based practice that does reduce costs and repeat offending, provides more satisfaction, and so on. In schools, we see the same outcomes where we see decreased referrals, and by that I mean disciplinary referrals, suspensions, police tickets in a variety of school districts. And I don't want it to be lost here, the connection between what happens in school systems and what happens in justice systems, specifically juvenile justice systems. There's increasing research coming out now on the impact of restorative approaches on racial disparity in schools. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. My intent is to demonstrate that they exist here. And I invite anybody to look these up or pause a moment if you're watching the recording of this. I'm sensitive to time here. So the good news, restorative practices are proven to reduce suspensions, arrests, and corresponding disparity and decreasing the chances of youth entry into the justice system, especially for minority youth. They're increasingly written into student codes of conduct and discipline matrices to have restorative rather than punitive or retributive approaches. There's much greater awareness of restorative responses in school settings. And at least in the US, I cannot speak to other countries and contexts, there are federal, state, and local initiatives to address discipline disparities and the impact it has on what we call the school to prison pipeline over time. There are innumerable cost benefits of using restorative approaches. One study reports a savings of almost $400 per offender for low-level offenses as compared with courts, enhanced community government relations, reduced incarceration costs for youth in detention. One youth diverted from a life of crime has been estimated at a saving $2.6 to $5.3 million over the course of their lifetime. Decreased recidivism. One person not in prison for a year may save up to $26,000 to $55,000 saved per person. So reduced court costs. When fewer cases go to court, when more cases are diverted at various stages in the process. And then there are health and mental health benefits. Reduced PTSD and associated disorders, increased restitution payments to victims of crime and harm and other harm, increased employment opportunities. There is, however, also less good news. And at least in the US, again, I can only speak to this context right now, federal and state initiatives are diminishing. And there are current executive presidential mandates against addressing implicit bias in federally funded training programs. This just happened last month, and there are many conversations now going on about the impact of that on those of us who do this work as a regular part of our justice and education work. There's limited investment in infrastructure, including technical support, data and information sharing. And many schools and justice systems don't really understand how to implement restorative processes with fidelity. So many things are called restorative that upon closer inspection are not in fact consistent with restorative values and principles. There's limited data on the impacts of reducing disparities. And what's important for this conversation is that justice and education system pathways are not always clear, direct, strong, and transparent. We don't always see that what happens in the justice system is a direct reflection of what's happening in our school systems. And those pathways need to be made far tighter and stronger. There are many obstacles to implementing well, ensuring fidelity, ensuring sufficient resources, making sure people are adequately trained, engaging parents both in justice and education processes, ensuring adequate ongoing funding. And the complaint I hear often in education environments, finding time, shifting the culture. What's really important to anybody looking to do restorative work and to engage that inside systems is that this is not a program to address punishment. It is a philosophical approach to being in right relationship. Consistent, again, with Renate's review of historical ways. And most of what she mentioned was not just about solving problems. It was actually about building relationship and ensuring that we have right relationship to address harm and conflict. I'm going to put in a quick plug here. I'm sure I'm running out of time. But I am also Vice President of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice in the US. This is the, at the moment, largest membership-based organization in the US. It may be comparable to the European Forum for Restorative Justice. And I won't read through all of this because Marta, am I out of time or close to it? But people can see here what we are committed to. This is the statement of who we are and what we do. And here is our mission, where we envision a safe and equitable world where restorative interactions transform individuals, relationships, community, and systems through the prevention. I'm sorry, I can't see that word because the screen is in the way. Prevention, repair, and deep healing of harm. Our mission is to advance community and restorative justice as a social movement by serving people and organizations committed to building community and addressing harm. NACRJ provides guidance and support to establish high quality practices with fidelity to restorative principles. And so finally, just to sum up, restorative justice may, I'm not saying, there are critiques and it is not perfect. And I don't want anybody to assume that my advocacy implies that I believe that this is a perfect solution, but it may represent a viable alternative to traditional justice processes. It focuses on repairing harm, including stakeholders, and importantly, changing relationships. And it has three main components: culture building, dialogue, and subsequent agreement. There is evidence for its effectiveness in schools and justice systems, and it may reduce the social and economic costs of justice. On that note, I will close. I know we're going to have questions and comments moving forward, but I really thank you all for being here and for your attention to these presentations, and I'm looking forward to hearing Ivo next. Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Thank you so much, Mara, and there are coming questions for you that you have to answer in the last minute. And thank you for just pointed that there are some petty thefts or some questions that don't have to go to the justice system. And you pointed very good the pros and cons of restorative justice and how we have to start in school. Well, now we have Ivo Aertsen. Ivo is a senior lecturer in the Leuven Institute of Criminology in Belgium and editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Restorative Justice. I want you to show the picture of the International Journal in Restorative Justice. For me, is the unique instrument or the unique journal that has many information and from different points of view about restorative justice. So the International Association wants to recommend it. You have hung it in our page, and Ivo is, as I said before, is the editor-in-chief. So Ivo, thank you very much for your time and for your friendship. You have the floor.
Marta. Thank you, Marta. Thank you for your kind invitation and for giving me the opportunity to present indeed the International Journal of Restorative Justice, a journal that was initiated in 2012. Because we were with a group of people internationally who felt the need to share experiences and research about restorative justice. So the International Journal is trying to do that by including not only academic articles, but also by including exchanges and interviews with people in practice. So that is also an important part of this International Journal. So I invite you very much to have a look at this International Journal, which is published by 11 international publishers in The Hague in the Netherlands at this moment. And they also are publishing a book series on restorative justice. So this having said, I would like to focus on the topic of today, restorative justice, of course. And as you have asked me, Marta, I would also like to stress some of the positive impacts, the potential, the opportunities, let's say, of restorative justice, focusing on juveniles indeed. But I would also like to, at the end of the 15 minutes, I would also like to formulate a couple of challenges indeed. So let me first start with the potential, the possibly positive impact of implementing restorative justice with juveniles. And my first point is that restorative justice, I think, has an important value on its own. It is something to give young persons, victims, and other concerned persons the possibility to meet, to ask questions, to explain, to become accountable, to make reparations, and to give meaning to what happened. That was all already explained by Renate and by Mara. Restorative justice, as we all know, refers to an inclusionary, participatory character of the approach. It is an opportunity, I would say, for people to be involved in a form of deliberative justice, participatory decision-making as well. It can provide not only a more satisfactory experience of justice for victims and offenders, but I think it can also strengthen and reinforce the capabilities of people to act as responsible citizens within a democratic society. This also implies children and young persons. They are also to be considered as citizens, of course. Therefore, this is my first principle. where we look at restorative justice from an emancipatory and socio-ethical approach. Participating in a restorative justice process has a value on its own in a democratic society. That is my first point. My second point is that, of course, with restorative justice, we hope for a certain impact when we are confronted with problems at a societal, at a collective level. Restorative justice can contribute to countering tensions in society, polarization in society at the collective level. Restorative justice, I believe, can give us the tools to contribute to building social peace, as was already said, to building social peace in an effective way. Restorative justice for me is an ongoing learning process for all who are sometimes part of a conflict, thus for us all. The strength of restorative justice is that it offers a learning process, a moral learning process that is effective because it combines affective, cognitive, and performative processes. By applying, by dealing with conflicts in practice, we also learn in an affective and cognitive way. My third point is the following. It refers to the educational potential of restorative justice at the more personal level, not that much at the macro social level. This is true not only for juveniles, but again for all involved, also for adults, of course. Here, we hope that participants in restorative justice develop new skills, new attitudes that will help them to take responsibility and to desist from crime. In this respect, meeting the victim and being confronted with the consequences of an offense may have an awareness creating and motivational effect, for the young person, on the condition that we can see and treat the young person as a valuable person in a respectful way. Fourth, restorative justice has the potential to reduce crime, as was already also shown by Marta. It is important here that we learn from desistance research as well, and to understand what makes that a delinquent person no longer commits crime. Very often, this must be seen in combination with other positive factors, influences, and developments in the life of a young person. So it means, and you all know that, it means that often participating in mediation or in a conferencing process is maybe not sufficient. It can help a lot. It can be a turning point for many people, but sometimes or often it also requires other interventions in order to really reduce reoffending or the chance of reoffending. My fifth point is the following. Restorative justice may be and should essentially be also in the interest of the victim, as was mentioned already also by Renate. Restorative justice is not just an answer to the question what to do with the young person or what kind of intervention we must activate for a young person, but also what are the needs of the victim and how amends to the victim can be made in this case. Now, this victim orientation very often requires a fundamental change of mindset for public prosecutors, juvenile judges, and social workers active in the field of juvenile delinquency. These professionals are used to work with offenders and to educate them, of course, and there is exactly their expertise. These professionals, however, are not used very often to look at the problem also from a victim's point of view. This means they have to adopt a new lens to define the problem situation differently. So, and I think this is really a big challenge when we try to develop and implement restorative justice within a juvenile justice context. My next point is about the economic and practical benefits of restorative justice, as was already mentioned by Marta. It has the potential to save money in terms of time, workload, financial costs, treatment costs for victims and their families that can be reduced in this way. So we have now also scientific evidence that it can have a cost, that can save costs for our governments. My next point is about other positive outcomes as documented now by international research. These other positive outcomes are satisfaction in general. We know very well now that victims and offenders who are participating in restorative justice processes in a general way are satisfied or very satisfied with both the process and the outcome of the intervention, of the restorative justice intervention. But it also increases the offender compliance with restitution as compared with restitution that is imposed by the court. And it also reduces fear amongst victims. Victims who have participated are less fearing to become victimized again. Another point is that restorative justice can help also to narrow the gap, the distance between society and public opinion on the one hand and the juvenile or criminal justice system on the other hand. Restorative justice, I think, can help to rebuild trust of people in the justice system of their country. Therefore, restorative justice also serves the interests of the justice system itself, I think. For all these reasons, we believe that restorative justice is a more constructive, positive approach to juvenile delinquency as compared to a merely punitive approach, for example, by isolating young persons from their communities or labeling them as criminals. Restorative justice can also be considered as a third way, apart from retributive justice and rehabilitative justice, some will argue. So these are all important possible benefits. There are, however, as I have mentioned, also a couple of challenges that must be taken into account. First, we must have a clear idea about restorative justice and values and principles. So we must be aware of what are important values, standards, and principles when we try to implement restorative justice. And we must try to apply these values and standards and principles in a consistent way. This all requires a good understanding of what restorative justice is, of course. The second challenge is the question how to involve families and local communities in restorative justice processes in order to avoid reducing the problem to the individual or personal level. Restorative justice is sometimes criticized because of its too much individualizing approach. It is reducing something that is by definition a social problem to a personal problem of people. And that might be a pitfall as well. So we must try to put the problem at the family level, at the local community level, and find the ways to also involve families and local communities in our responses, in our restorative responses to delinquency. The third challenge is that in a local program, when we set up a local program, we must try to be flexible, I think. We should try to have the option between various restorative justice models. We should not just opt for one model, be it victim-offender mediation or family group conferences or peacemaking circles. It is important, I think, to start from the needs in a given case, and then, depending on the characteristics and the needs in a given case, then to choose which method or model is most appropriate in restorative justice. The fourth challenge refers to the need to provide legal protection and legal safeguards for people who are participating also in restorative justice processes. And there, I think there's an important role for legal professionals, also for juvenile judges, to double check, to have a kind of control whether these legal and procedural safeguards have been respected in all the cases. A fifth challenge is on how to cope with social structural inequalities and injustices when doing restorative justice. We very often are working with people that are coming from disadvantaged groups, indeed, disadvantaged at the educational, social, cultural, or economic level. So we have to deal with forms of racism and discrimination in society. And that is very often a challenge for restorative justice programs. Restorative justice is not just about a satisfactory story, but it is also about social justice. So, and we must be able to make the connection, the link in our restorative processes to these underlying social structural elements and causes of crime. This is important, but not easy to realize, of course. Finally, last challenge that I would like to mention is that we should not mix up restorative justice interventions with other types of social interventions. Sometimes people believe that as soon as we apply a community-oriented intervention, it is restorative justice. That is not necessarily the case. So again, we must be aware of the values, principles, and standards that are particular for restorative justice. So far, some of the benefits and the challenges about restorative justice. And I'm looking forward now to listening to you and to hear your questions. Thank you.
Okay, Mara, thank you very much, Ivo, as always, to show us and to give the framework of how we can work with restorative justice, the challenges, the negative points of the way to implement. And I want to point, as you say, the need to implement, to get the best way to deal with a case, because in South America, restorative justice is many times seems just as a penal mediation, and it's very, and it's a more wider way of working with the different cases. Now, Mara, you have your last 3 minutes to close your paper, and I sending you the questions to your mail, so as then you can give like a to reframe them in one or two can give the answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you clarify for me if I'm doing a closing here or responding to questions? Or
no, now you have 2 minutes or 3 minutes from the closing if you want to use them. If not, we can go to the questions.
Got it.
It's a friendly talk, so we can choose the way to go on.
Right. And those who know me know I'm quite informal about these things too.
Okay, it's good.
I really don't have a lot to say. I don't need 3 minutes. What I am struck and impressed by is the linkages between these 3 conversations, that we all came to this conversation from a slightly different perspective, both professionally and geographically.
Yes.
And what I'm struck by is our attention to many of the same issues. So how are marginalized youth involved? What are the pathways between different institutions and the justice system? How do we handle issues of things that should not be handled in a formal process? And how do we give voice to youth who are typically not heard? And so I hear much, and I mentioned earlier some of my responses to some of what Renate said, but I also hear in what Ivo is saying, which I appreciate because it ties into this, the need for local flexibility, the need to understand those values and to elevate them, the need to understand the impact of social and economic and other disadvantage and how we do that in both formal and informal structures, my words, not his. And I particularly like, Ivo, your comment about reducing social problems to the individual level and not acknowledging the social context within which we tend, because it is easier, to address individual faults and flaws rather than to address the context that we have created that causes those things to happen. And I can't stress strongly enough there is debate in the field. Okay, Marta, I lied. I am going to take more time than I thought. But the persistent debates in the field between, is this a practice or is this a movement? And those who disagree about the value of this as a social movement and what that means on a variety of levels, as distinguished from a set of individual practices to deal with individual harm that continues to locate problems and issues in the individual. And I think I've been in this work for nearly 30 years now, as has Ivo. We met, I don't know, 25 or 30 years ago in this. And we continue to have that same conversation. We continue to have the debate about the degree to which this is a social movement or this is a set of practices to address harm, because the latter is easier. The latter is an approach that locates individual events, and we can deal with individual events, where it is much harder to address structural inequality, structural violence, institutional racism, all of those things that occur that are far more difficult and cumbersome and complex to address in a restorative or any other context. So I'm going to leave it there for a moment, and then we'll get to questions.
Okay, Ivo, do you want to give us your closing remarks, or because we don't have so much time, or you prefer to answer the questions? I think Ivo is frozen.
I think he froze. Oh dear.
He's frozen. Okay.
Oh, he's back.
Okay.
I did not understand very well.
Okay, you are back again.
Interrupted.
Yes, yes. Ivo, do you want to give your closing remarks? Yes.
Okay. Very quickly, yeah. I can do so, yes. I think an important point is indeed that that we should take care of the community and what to do with the community that is reluctant when we set up restorative justice programs, how to build support in the community. So because the community has an important, is an important resource, of course, but can also be
internet problems.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm back now.
Yes.
Okay, so this was broken. Okay, what I meant to say is that community for restorative justice can be an important resource, but also an important obstacle, of course. We have also repressive and punitive tendencies in the communities, in our communities, of course, in all our countries. And sometimes they are more stronger than tolerance and so on. So we really have to take care of that in our restorative justice policies and strategies as well. We have to build societal support, and we have to do that in a methodological way. And building cooperation with the media is one of the ways on how to do that. I think it is important to reach out to the local community, to the national community, and to do that in a strategic way. So we should ask help from people who have more expertise in communication strategies, and we should ask help from maybe journalists or other experts on how to communicate, how to inform, how to educate in a certain way the public about that. That is important, and if we don't do that, then we will never be able to make restorative justice mainstream in our societies, I think. So we need methodological skills to inform the public as well. Yeah, that is an important point, I think. My second point, and then I stop. My second point is, I think, also what Renate mentioned, is how to ensure equal access for everyone to restorative justice. All too often, I think we see restorative justice as something that we can use only for a first offender, or for a juvenile, or for petty offenses and so on. Restorative justice in my view, is not a measure or a sanction that you can impose on people. I think it is much more a service, an offer. You offer a forum, a possibility for a victim and for an offender to talk about what happened and to have a dialogue and to make amends, to become responsible and to make amends and to give a meaning to what happened. So this is not a sanction. This is not something that you can impose. You can only create the conditions, and you can only provide a place, a forum, a safe environment where people are able to meet. And very often they need the help of a mediator or a facilitator. But if you have a good mediator, a good facilitator, then it is amazing to see how people who are each other's enemies in the beginning are able to talk to each other. That is the strong element of restorative justice, of course. But we must provide equal access for everyone and not be selective to certain groups, I think, in society.
Thank you very much. Mara, you have 2 minutes to answer the questions.
Yikes. Okay. I'm going to go really fast.
Okay.
There's a question about, are there gender differences? Are Black girls more likely to be prosecuted than white girls? Yes. Black anybody is more likely to be prosecuted than white anybody. Black girls are more likely to be pushed out of school systems. There's a great book called Push Out by a woman named Monique Morris. I encourage you to read that. How important is it to educate the population about restorative justice? It's essential, because if a population doesn't know what it is, then they cannot possibly either advocate for it, request it, nor engage in it in any way. So it is important, and that there are not necessarily clear structures for doing that. Is neuroscience important for restorative justice? Good question. Yes, and there's a wonderful YouTube video by a guy named Dan Wiesel, if I'm saying that right, who talks about the neural pathways in the amygdala that can be recreated when an individual is given an opportunity to experience love, empathy, respect, kindness, understanding, and how that actually rebuilds neural pathways in the amygdala in the brain. I encourage you to watch that video. It's on YouTube by Dan Wiesel. It's a TEDx talk. Since the government is diminishing use of restorative justice, how can you keep making it stronger? Another good question. Again, I have to speak in the US context, but there is a difference in the US context between what happens at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. I didn't also mention on this, but one of this is I'm actually a local elected politician in addition to my academic roles. And in the US, we have elected school boards, and I sit on the school board in my community. So what happens is there's a tension between the branches of government and local control. And one of the ways that you make it stronger is as I have come to believe, all politics is local, all initiatives are local. You focus at the local level. What can I do here and now in my community? To say the government is diminishing use of restorative justice is a broad term. There are many governments. There are 51 state governments. There is one national government, and there are innumerable and uncountable localities. So governments operate in different ways, have different priorities, have different ideological perspectives and different philosophies about how to deal with harm and conflict. So you address those through advocacy, you address those through legislation, and you address those at the very local level in communities, directly in communities. That was fast because you told me I had to go fast, but there's so much more to say on all of this.
Well, thank you very much, Mara, for taking respect with the time. Now, Ivo, your challenge to answer the questions.
Marta, my problem is that I don't see the questions in the chat room because maybe my Zoom was interrupted at a moment. So,
okay,
again in one or another way.
It's let me see. What is your opinion? The main obstacle a community faces when trying to apply restorative justice for the first time, And the second one is how important is the media coverage of cases handled through restorative justice. And the last one, how important is getting the parents involved in case of juvenile justice.
Well, I have already touched upon the first two questions, I think, when I just talked about the community and the role of the media and how to build, and that it is important to build cooperation and relationship with the media as well, I think. But I can only repeat that this is a challenge because you must find good media, good journalists to cooperate with you. And maybe a good practice for a national organization on mediation or restorative justice is to hire a media expert or a journalist. For example, our colleagues in Norway have done so. The national mediation organization, they have a professional journalist as a staff member, and he or she will reformulate some stories, success stories, so to present them to newspapers and to TV and radio and social media and so on. So that is something that we should try to do, I think. But I know very well that the situation in terms of the function of the media can be very different from country to country. This kind of media cultures are very different between our countries. So again, we must develop a way that is appropriate for our own country, I think. The other question was about the participants, I think, in juvenile justice or restorative justice. Well, the young person, of course, the victim, of course, as well. And very often we feel the need to also involve support persons, the communities of care, let's say, both for the young person, but also for the victim. So we should not only do that for the young person to invite family members, but maybe also ask and invite the victim whether she or he would like to be supported when meeting the offender by a friend or a family member or so. So this involving the communities of care is important, I think. But it might also be beneficial to involve other community members to really give the community a voice in the restorative justice process as well. But we cannot do that in the model of mediation. Then you go into the direction of community circles or peacemaking circles. And you have in Latin America also experiences in several countries with peacemaking and community circles, of course. So I think this is a very promising development, but again, it must be done in a good way because there are also risks and pitfalls, of course, when you involve the community. You can make the thing worse, of course, instead of bringing peace to a concrete situation.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, as Renata has left. It has been so interesting meeting. We have been talking and interchanging ideas and experiences for 1 hour and 40 minutes. So we'll have a second round next year to continue with this, with the different topics and the different visions of restorative justice. Okay, thank you. On behalf of the International Association, I want to thank you again, and we wish that many people will go through through YouTube to see it, and seeing soon, depending of this pandemic. Thank you very much, Mara. Thank you very much, Ivo, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marta, for the invitation.
No, thank you. It has been so interesting and very, now I think that the people speaking French or different, the Portuguese and so on, are going to see it again in YouTube. Thank you again.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Keep safe.
Okay,
Thank you very
bye-bye.
much. Thank you for the invitation.
Bye.